Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, host of the Vision for Life podcast, and Hunter is joining me on the podcast today. Hunter, welcome.
Hello, Autumn.
Wow, that's an interesting greeting.
I've been watching Seinfeld reruns, and Newman always gets greeted, "Hello, Newman." So, Autumn goes with Newman.
Does it?
It sounds similar. feels the same in the mouth.
All right. Well, I'm glad you're joining me today. We are returning from our short summer break with a discussion on a book by Mark Sayers called A Non-Anxious Presence, how a changing and complex world will create a remnant of renewed Christian leaders. We're going to take on this book discussion in two parts, and so today is part one.
I think this is our first book reading in our VFL Reads series. We've done a lot of articles, right?
Yes.
But never a whole book. And so you and I both read this recently, thought it was really helpful in thinking about how to not just lead organizations and groups of people, but just how to lead even small things like your own family in today's world. It's a short book, only a couple hundred pages, including all the footnotes. And it's a subject that I've thought a lot about. So some of the other authors that Mark Sayers is referencing are authors that I've read and studied. And so this has been an ongoing study of mine for probably the last 7 or 8 years about how do you lead with what he's calling a non-anxious presence. We'll define all of that. So I thought this would be fun for our listeners as well, and I hope they'll pick up a copy of this book.
Yeah, it is a really great read. I think on a just day-to-day common interaction level, we are discussing, at least I've had many of these discussions, a sense of unease or upheaval in our day-to-day lives, perhaps in a school our kids attend, or in the way that we see conversations taking place on social media, or in the way that major media outlets are going about covering certain events, local events or national events. And we carry this sense right now of sort of just the question is, what is going on? And am I the only one who feels this cognitive dissonance and can't quite sort out or put my finger on how to make sense of the moment that we're living through right now?
And you probably are the only one, because I think everyone else has probably navigated the last 6 or 7 years pretty well, but maybe you've gotten a little triggered. So
this discussion is like my personal therapy session.
It really is. And if you think about what we've been through as a society, since like say 2016, starting with the 2016 election, there's that was one of the most contentious elections probably in American history. And I say that being a student of history, like, probably the time around the Civil War, the election of Lincoln was really contentious. There was another populist leader, Andrew Jackson. His election was pretty contentious. There were several that. So I don't think the 2016 election was like the only time we've ever seen that in the history of America, but it was up there with being contentious. That really began, I think, a season 6 years ago, 7 years ago, of us just feeling like everything is kind of coming apart. And then there have been a number of marker events. So we've had all kinds of upheaval over racial injustice. Then we've started to debate the history of America and how we should teach kids the history of America. That's sometimes called CRT, or the debate about critical race theory. And that has gotten into public schools, where parents in public schools are now navigating this. We've seen an acceleration of the revolution in how we view gender and sexuality, and that's also in the schools. We've lived through COVID, and how do we respond to that? We've lived through a lot of mass shootings. We have had the Me Too movement exposing sexual abuse. That's also had a religious component to it. Churches have been exposed. Large churches have been exposed for having this. We've seen a lot of larger institutions be called into question. So that's all happened in 6 or 7 years. And so it probably explains why you're saying like, hey, it seems like something's different. I've been in ministry 15 years, and it certainly seems different in the last 7 or 8 than it did in the first 7 or 8.
So we all are living through this era, not just me. Your first statement was maybe a little sarcastic.
A little tongue in cheek, And our author calls this anxiety, and it's not a term that he invented. It's a phrase that's being used by quite a few sociologists. One in particular he cites is a now deceased author named Edwin Friedman, who was a rabbi and a family therapist, and he really introduced this idea, best we can tell, in the 80s, I believe. He wrote a book called A Failure of Nerve, and for me, it's one of those top 20 most helpful books I've ever read in terms of understanding the world I live in and what it feels like to lead in this world. But he calls it anxiety, and this we probably need to explain what that term means. The title of this book assumes that you kind of know what that means, a non-anxious presence. So what does he mean by anxiety?
I have read that book too, Hunter, that you mentioned, because we read it as a staff team several years ago, and have returned to the concepts in that book over and over. They do help us definitely make sense of the culture and society and the effects we feel within it, and then how to exist and lead in a culture that can be very anxious. And you said, let's examine what Friedman means by anxiety. So he does not mean clinical anxiety, the sort that an individual would seek treatment for.
That's right. So he's not talking about the kind of anxiety that you go to a therapist and you have diagnosed. So that's not what it means. But if you think about what that word to be anxious is, it's to be worried or to be concerned. And so he's talking about this state of being kind of chronically worried or chronically concerned about our world or about our safety, or you can be chronically concerned about your children and their safety or what they're learning. And it's probably helpful to differentiate what we might call acute anxiety from chronic anxiety. Just like a sickness, an acute sickness is one that, or an acute injury is one that happens quickly, you feel it, your body responds to it, then you heal from it and you move on. So acute anxiety is when there's real danger, you are really worried, you have a heightened sense of worry, which you need to have. It's a protective instinct, it helps you stay alive. And then once the danger passes, you kind of return to a normal state. Chronic anxiety is when you're always on high alert and you never get off high alert. You never get to kind of return to normal. And so the observation is our society kind of lives in this state of perpetual worry about a number of things. And sometimes one of the signs of chronic anxiety is that you just feel worried or burdened or concerned or tired or overwhelmed, and you can't even quite name exactly what's causing it. It's just a general feeling or sense that you have.
And then one of Friedman's key insights is that that kind of chronic anxiety is shared. Anywhere there is connectedness between people, it can spread in a networked sort of fashion. So anxiety can exist in a family system. He worked and wrote a lot about family systems theory. And then that can even occur in a larger group of people, in an organization or in a society. It can spread via other networks, as we'll discuss, like social media. And so one of his key insights was the way in which this chronic anxiety exists not only as a state of worry that we experience as an individual, but really can be shared amongst people and take a sort of presence of its own within an entire system of people.
And a quote from Mark Sayer's book might help. This is him explaining what Edwin Friedman taught. He writes on page 41, the late Edwin Friedman, rabbi and family therapist, argued that anxiety became a dominant factor in contemporary culture. Friedman's central argument was that modern American society was awash in worry. He warned that, quote, anxiety is so deep within the emotional processes of our nation that it's almost as though neurosis has become nationalized. And he's saying that in the 80s. And you think about all the stuff that we've been through in 40 years, and especially in the last 6 or 7, that observation seems to be even more pertinent today.
And Sayers, based on Friedman's work, talks about not only the anxious age in which we live, but also what happens with that anxiety. And he says, I believe that institutions often functioned in this role in cultures, in society, that absorbed the anxiety that had spread within a system. And so what is happening right now? Why does this era feel particularly anxious? And how is that related to this observation about institutions?
If you think about what institutions do, which institutions are large groups of people, or typically who have founded some kind of organization, and it has a leadership structure, it has a decision-making processes to it. It typically has some founding, guiding principles that we're all committed to, and it takes on a life of its own that is intended to outlive any one person or even any one generation, right? Friedman says those institutions, the existence of those institutions, absorbs anxiety in the culture. A way to think about that might be, think of how the United States Senate and House of Representatives, the Congress, is an institution. And it's an institution that is meant to, it does absorb a lot of the anxiousness, or it was designed to, within a republic of different cultures of people living together in a common nation. It has these founding principles, and they're codified in a constitution, and it's committed to these rights. And then it was a place where, through representative government, people could bring their concerns, and they even set it up so that, like, the House of Representatives could be a little bit more volatile, because those folks get elected every 2 years, so it could be more volatile. There'd be more people there, and the Senate they called it a cooling chamber. It like kind of takes that debate and calms it down and works toward consensus, and that's how our institution was meant to function. If it doesn't function well, which it doesn't function too well right now, if it doesn't function too well, if we start to question the legitimacy of it, then all those debates have to go somewhere. And Friedman's observing where they go is we all start to bear them individually rather than the institution absorbing the shock of them. Another good example would be how we set up transfer of power in the U.S. from one presidential administration to another. And regardless of party, we have basically upheld that way of doing things for our nation's entire history. And so that absorbs a lot of the tension that exists even between political parties, such that when a Democrat is transferring power to a Republican, they're both still standing there honoring the institution of the presidency and the peaceful transfer of power. That didn't happen on January 6th of 2021. That didn't happen. The first time it hadn't happened in our history. And just the fear that unleashed for a lot of people. We can debate whether it was really in danger of collapsing or not, but just the fear that unleashed for so many people, and the how unsettling that was, had a massive effect. Now we started to think, there's always been this tension of some Americans thinking election is somehow illegitimate. That's always been some minor strain within our society. For that to kind of overwhelm that whole process just started to make people worry. And if you read some corners of media, people have been worrying about that now ever since that happened.
When an institution does not observe its own values or processes, as in this example that you're giving us, the experience of the people affected by that institution is that the institution itself has sustained a sort of delegitimization, and then the security that the institution may have provided before, even if it was challenged from time to time, as you're saying, is suddenly the reaction against that and the result is this fear or anxiety that the individuals are then left to absorb, because the predictability in what was the process that was established by that institution is shattered. And it's almost as if you're saying the response can be, was this an illusion all along? And so then the anxiety that the institution absorbed is pushed back into the individual sphere.
And this is happening across the cultural landscape. So this is not like, well, you know, the right wingers or the left wingers are destroying institutions. It's really not a problem that exists in one stream of American culture. It exists really across the board. So I just gave an example where anxiety from the right about the illegitimacy of an election kind of overwhelmed the peaceful transfer of power. That was January 6th. I could give examples of more of liberal anxiety overwhelming institutions. For a long time, I enjoyed reading the New York Times as a newspaper. I mean, I still read it, but I enjoy, one of the reasons I found it beneficial was it represented the left viewpoint in America, and I wanted to be, even if I don't always agree with that viewpoint, I wanted to be aware of what it was. And it represented a pretty broad spectrum. There's a spectrum on the left, and it represented a spectrum from slightly left of center to really left of center. And what happened during the Trump presidency really is the far left of center anxiety overwhelmed the more centrist left inside that institution, the New York Times, such that the more centrist left voices and editorial voices there, they essentially had to leave and left. So now what that paper represents day in, day out is a far more polarized perspective than it represented just 6 or 7 years ago. And so that's another institution that like has kind of gotten overwhelmed in some sense by the anxiousness of the age we live in.
And then you as a reader can even pick up on some of that anxiety, and you see it and sense it in a way via your interaction with the paper itself, with the actual publication. You can see and pick up on the way that anxiety has inhabited that institution, and then you feel the effect of it. So our consensus is in what Mark Sayers is bringing out in the book, in the work of Edwin Friedman that we have referenced and that Sayers relies heavily on in his own work. And then in our own examples, we can say we live in an era in which we're experiencing a lot of upheaval. We feel the tension, and that spreads. We experience it, and that spreads to different systems. We see it in challenges to institutions, and we call this anxiety. Sayers also makes another key observation that we want to talk about. He gives this era itself a term. He calls it a gray zone. What is that? What does he mean by this term gray zone?
By gray zone, he means a transitional era of history when an old age is passing away and some kind of new reality is trying to break in, and yet the new reality hasn't fully broken in and the old hasn't fully passed away. You're just kind of in between. And so he's basically saying the old way of the world being ordered is kind of dying, but there's not like a new reality that we've all kind of learned to live with yet. And so we feel this tension. He writes on page 22, a gray zone is confusing and contradictory. It's filled with change and conflict. Everything seems to be up in the air. And one of the markers that he's noticing of this gray zone is what we've been discussing. It's the decline of institutions, and then it is the emergence of what he calls a networked world, meaning rather than solving a lot of our problems through institutions, we now try to solve them through networks. Like just think about how we try to solve them on Twitter or on arguing with people on Facebook. We try to solve them in networked kind of relationships, and those are just inherently less stable and more anxious than the institutional kind of relationships we used to have.
So this gray zone that he's identifying is the era in between the passing of one era and the coming of the next. It's an era of resorting and determining what the power structures of the coming era will be. So it actually is a time of upheaval. We don't just sense this and feel it in so many ways via the examples you've already given us. This is actually what we're living through. And it does feel as though the last 6 years have been different because they actually have been.
They have been different. And in some ways, they have been just the acceleration of trends that were already present. And so it's not like the last 6 years have been different as much as there have been a number of events, which we kind of named at the beginning here, which just accelerated what was already going on in the world we live in.
Another way that I hear this being discussed is that in so many ways, we're in an era as one age passes and in this in between of deconstruction. We hear this term applied to religion, to Christianity, to institutions, to deconstruction of our history. You referenced critical race theory, to deconstruction of our actual organizational structures. What should a school look like? What should it accomplish? And we have not yet reconstructed anything in its place. So we are in an era of questioning and tearing down, but nothing yet has inhabited the new power structure or the new way to bring order in what will be a coming era.
That's right. And if our listeners have been tracking with us so far, our conversation has probably only made them more anxious because we basically said we live in an anxious world. Anxiety spreads really fast. There's been a lot of events that trigger that. It's a gray zone. Everything's up in the air. Institutions are collapsing. But Mark Sayers doesn't write this book to make us more anxious. He actually says, if you look at biblical history, God has often brought renewal out of transitional gray zone times. He's often brought renewal into his people who are living through anxious times. He notices that pattern biblically. And so he's trying to give us hope for revival, for spiritual renewal. Do you see that pattern biblically?
You were right. If we just ended our conversation there, this would be a very anxiety-filled conversation. But that isn't the point of Sayers' book, nor is it the point of our discussion today. But it does help us understand the reason that we feel and sense this, that we don't necessarily day to day know how to make sense of what we're experiencing and feeling. And so what Sayers is doing in this part of the explanation of gray zone is giving us ways to simply understand that. Now, to your second statement there, Hunter, about he's actually calling out the possibility of renewal and saying that challenge such as we're experiencing now in this in-between era, in this gray zone, can bring about growth and renewal. And he points out that God often uses these moments in history to bring about renewal. So what would be some examples of that, either biblically or historically, how that pattern has occurred? And we can look back and see that God does use these transitional moments to bring about renewal.
I think one of the best examples is when Israel went into exile and ultimately were deported by the Babylonians. In my quiet times, I've been reading through the prophet Jeremiah, and now I'm into Ezekiel. These were prophets who were ministering. Jeremiah, right as Jerusalem was collapsing and ultimately being conquered by Babylon, and he's prophesying that this is all going to happen. And then Ezekiel ministers to the people who are living in exile. And it was this time when literally the nation was collapsing and her kingdom was collapsing. And the message Jeremiah brings is, yes, we're collapsing. This is in contrast to false prophets who are like, God's going to save us. And Jeremiah is like, nope, the word I have from the Lord is he's not going to save us. We are collapsing. Our kingdom is going into exile, and it's God's work. He's using the Babylonians to do this, and then he turns and says, so if you'll accept this as God's discipline on his people, he is going to bring renewal eventually out of this. I see that as an example, and that's exactly what happened. The exiles did later return. Some of them returned to Jerusalem, and there was a remnant of Israel that lived in her land. It was not as significant as it has been in the heyday of their kingdom, but that remnant persevered for 400 years, and some of them are faithful and eventually gives birth to the Messiah. And there's even an emphasis in how the New Testament writers narrate the birth of Jesus, or the events surrounding the birth of Jesus, that his family, Mary, his mother, Joseph, his father, his cousin John the Baptist's parents, are part of this faithful remnant who is clung to hope in God even in the midst of a very dark time, and literally the Savior is born, the renewing Messiah is born into that remnant, and through that remnant, and God begins doing his new covenant work through them, this season of renewal. That's the preeminent biblical pattern. We see this throughout church history. The church goes into a season of decline. It typically parallels a season of cultural decline, and God brings renewal out of that. And it's always happens by them returning to the gospel and returning to the authority of Scripture, and not just returning to it in an intellectual, we're committed to it sense, but God starts to use that word to quicken and enliven and refresh and rejuvenate them in their own hearts, and that spreads. And so Mark Sayers is holding out hope here in this season of massive cultural upheaval where everyone is anxious, the gray zone he calls it. That could be a time when God will bring renewal out of this. It's up to him. It's in his timing, but this is the seed of renewal.
Sayers does hone in on one particular tool that God uses in these times to bring about renewal. And he identifies that resource as leaders, and particularly leaders who have a certain sort of presence. And that's what he's examining in the majority of the book. That's where he wants to land, and hence the title of the book, A Non-Anxious Presence. And that's actually present in the examples you just gave, Hunter, even of the way Jeremiah existed. He was honest, but it seems that in a time when Israel was experiencing upheaval in their institutions, in their political system, in their religious system, in their family networks, some of their families were actually torn apart as they were carried into exile, that he maintained that sort of presence as he relayed God's message and continually pointed people back to God and God's presence. And then in the examples of church history, similarly, that is often what we focus on when we look back at these eras in which the church experienced decline and then renewal. God used particular people and leaders in each of those moments.
I've been reading Martin Luther's biography this year, as I've shared a couple of times on this podcast, and reading his story just impressed upon me how anxious his world was that he lived in, how dissatisfied everyone was with the state of the church. They didn't even know to call it the Catholic Church. It was just the church, how dissatisfied they were with the state of the church, with spirituality, how dissatisfied he was. God literally renewed him through his word, renewed Martin Luther. As I'm reading about Luther's renewal, I myself am experiencing in my own heart the beauty and the wonder of the gospel. There was just something fresh about the way Luther experienced it, and to see him writing about it, I'm like, yes, God's grace is amazing. I'm like myself, seeing the beauty of the gospel. God did that in Martin Luther, and then spread it to a whole corner of the world and eventually throughout the world. So that's another example. So you said the tool God uses is renewed leaders. And I don't think we have to imagine leaders in the institutional, organizational leader sense, or like leading large groups of people. But just if you have a renewed, what he calls non-anxious presence, God uses people with that kind of presence to lead or to influence his people back toward life and health.
One great summary of this from the book is this section It says, we imagine that someone is suited to leadership because of their charisma, drive, intelligence, training, or achievements. Instead, Friedman argued that the most vital attribute to lead, especially in anxious human environments and systems, was a non-anxious presence. Thus, the leader's chief tool of influence is their presence. And that speaks to what you were just saying, Hunter, that really a leader does not have to be someone with a particular institutional position. It can be anyone who responds thoughtfully in a way that allows their presence to influence the people that they're connected to. And that can be in a family, that can be in a fellowship group, that can be in a friendship. Anyone can exhibit this kind of leadership quality and ability.
The paragraph you just read is why Edwin Friedman's book is one of my top 20 books of all time, because the thing that dawned on me, and this was like a fresh realization when I'm probably 10 years into pastoring, is, leading is not just about the right techniques. And it's not just about casting a vision and calling people to it or driving towards something or building a strategy. It's not just about managing people. All of that's important, not devaluing any of that. But leadership is about presence. And Edwin Friedman even says leadership is an emotional process. It's not just a technique you can master. It's an emotional process, meaning you have to be mastered by something more powerful than you, and you have to bring a certain kind of presence into the group or the environment or the team or the organization or the family that you lead. And when that dawned on me, I just started to see reality in a completely different way.
In an anxious, networked age in which we experience the transfer of information so quickly, we can easily become so shaped by that and by the expectation that leaders who we do still look to, sometimes leaders within a family, but sometimes within institutions too, should respond in a way that is more conditioned by our anxious age than by this sort of presence. And so we've briefly talked about a biblical example of how God uses these times of renewal and how Jeremiah is one example of a non-anxious presence in that. And in the Reformation, similarly, how Martin Luther was an example of this sort of presence in it. We see the parallels of the decline in our current age. What are the parallels of that sort of leadership in a kind of current example? How does this affect how you would go about leading fellowship right now in an era in which we do have expectations that are conditioned by an anxious networked era?
One of the most practical applications of this for me is I typically am not able to respond to all the anxiousness in our world at the speed at which the world kind of demands it. I'm not able to respond, and not only am I not able to without becoming anxious, it's not helpful for me to. So it's not helpful to Fellowship Denver for me to be giving quick takes on every single thing that happens. I can remember this when COVID started. My inclination was like to jump on a video and like give a video every week, like here's a quick update, you know. And I'm just not sure that would have been helpful, nor am I sure that I could have kept that up and stayed reasonably sane. So part of the thing that I've had to learn is you just have to be comfortable with some level of stuff swirling around you and still maintain a little bit of emotional distance. He's going to say it's important to stay connected, so I don't mean being like emotionally distant, but just enough to where you can think. Mark Sayers calls this being non-reactive. He writes on page 98, as a network is swamped by chronic anxiety, it's marked by reactivity. Those within the system no longer act rationally, but rather high emotion becomes the dominant form of interaction. So think of any argument you've had about something that's really important to you, where you look back later on that argument and go, man, I just kind of got swept up in the emotion of that. He's saying that's really happening all over our world. The system's focus is directed toward the most emotionally immature and reactive members, meaning like the angriest people can sometimes like distract your attention, or the ones that are demanding, like, we got to know where you stand, we got to hear your voice. Those can suddenly like start to influence the whole direction in which you lead. He says those who are more mature and healthy begin to adapt their behavior to appease the most irrational and unhealthy. There can be a sense of like, well, if I could just calm these people down, if I could just like give them an answer, that would help. And that's how leaders get sucked up into this. He's noticing. So his solution is that leaders have to be non-reactive. You can't always let your attention or your energy or your emotion just get distracted by whatever the demands are. And one of the things Friedman brings out that I don't know if Sayers brings out as much, but one of the things Friedman brings out is you have to stay focused on what your highest or most important goal is as a leader.
So a recent occurrence that obviously is top of my mind and probably of many others is the Supreme Court decision in the Dobbs v. Jackson case that effectively overturned Roe v. Wade and put the power to make decisions about abortion back into the hands of the states. This is obviously a really heated discussion that's being had in a very anxious way on social media, in the national media. So how then, given what you just explained about keeping what is primary and not being reactive, how then does that affect your response and that of our actual church leadership in an atmosphere with a discussion happening on a national stage and an individual stage like this? I
love that you're asking for a real-time example, and we're having this conversation in July. So this has been a real live conversation in my own heart and mind and among our elder team. So when it's announced, when the decision is announced, you start to get a lot of requests like, hey, some of it is from friends. Hey, what do you think about this? Can we talk about this? The requests are everything from can we talk about it more to I'd love to hear what you think about this to can the church make a statement about this? What does the church think about this? What's their position on this? So these kinds of requests start to happen. And I flagged it for our elders and said, hey, I think this would be something good for us to think about. Now, we have a pretty good consensus among our team as we talk about it. Like, here's our highest goal. We are, first of all, committed to the sanctity of life of the unborn. We think biblically that's a really important thing to hold to. And then we also want to see the church be equipped, I mean like the capital C church, be equipped to defend the sanctity of life of the unborn and also to care for mothers and who are facing unwanted pregnancy and to address some of the other issues that surround the whole environment of abortion. And we say that because like here in Colorado, we're probably going to live in a state where it's legal for now. And so we have to think about it through this holistic lens. And so we want our church to prioritize the unborn and know why that's a biblical commitment. And we want to also think about how we support all of life. That's our goal. And then if I was to say, what's our goal on top of that? It's to just disciple our church, to teach our church toward that. And then as we start to go, where are the average member of fellowship on that? Well, there's probably all over the map. So now I have work to do in terms of teaching and providing environments for people to process and to ask questions. And so what we kind of land is like, we actually need to do some careful teaching, very similar to what we've done with, say, sexuality in the past, very similar to what we've done with race. We need to do some careful teaching. We need to provide space for people to ask questions and process. We don't simply need to assume that everyone already agrees with that and understands, because people are at different places in their discipleship journey. That process right there is kind of slow that I'm describing. Like, it's kind of slow. It doesn't move at the speed of Twitter reactions, right? So that's kind of the conversation we're having right now, and we're making plans to do that. it doesn't satisfy the feeling I have that I need to say something right away. And if I could just say something right away, I could like kind of help everyone, calm down. It doesn't satisfy that feeling, which like I feel that pressure. It doesn't satisfy that, but I think it does point to this bigger goal. And sometimes you have to be willing to just live with a little bit of discomfort right now, not try to just feel better, and ask, what's the longer term goal here? Let's take the long approach. And so that's kind of the conversation that we're having. That's a real life problem. Good question. Thanks for putting me on the spot.
Yeah. That longer, slower, non-reactive presence maybe doesn't allay all the bad feelings or allow you to make an informational statement quickly, but it does make room for presence, the sort of presence that is indicated in the necessity of being a leader who can bring about health and encourage people to engage in something that actually works towards our hope is growth.
I think that's really well said. And I'm going to just read one last quote from Mark Sayers here that I think drives this point home. And then we'll talk more in our next episode about practically how do we all begin to do this. But here's what he says. He says, the leader who wishes to operate as a non-anxious presence within an emotionally unhealthy system must understand a fundamental principle. So vital was this principle that Friedman labeled it the keys to the kingdom. The fundamental principle was to remain present within the unhealthy environment while enduring the sabotage, backlash, and undermining that leaders inevitably face when trying to act as non-anxious presences in anxious social systems. Now, I don't see our church as an unhealthy system, but I do see our world as an unhealthy system, and I live as a pastor in the middle of this world. So my job is to stay present in the world and present in the church in a non-reactive, thoughtful, what's the real goal in mind here way, and to endure what he calls sabotage, backlash, undermining, or you could just say anxiety, to just endure this stuff and continue to lead us forward. That's how I process leading. That's why this is so helpful. I think that's how a parent can process parenting. I think this is how you could process being in a presence in your company, in your work, in your neighborhood, in your HOA.
Hunter, thank you. In our next discussion, part 2 of our discussion about Mark Sayers' book, A Non-Anxious Presence, we're going to ask together, discuss, how do we develop into this sort of person who can bring a non-anxious, connected, but differentiated presence into all those spheres that you just mentioned. So how can we develop into the sort of person, the sort of leader that can thoughtfully and lovingly lead within our companies, within our friendships, in our families, and for you and I in our church? Thanks for having this discussion with me today. I'm looking forward to picking this up with you.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to part 2 as well. And I'm excited to take some of this that sounded theoretical and hopefully make it applicable and practical for all of us.
If you have questions, suggestions, comments about today's episode, or about something you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, you can send any of those things anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.